He invited his ex-wife to mock her at his wedding. Then black SUVs pulled up. What would you do if someone invited you only to humiliate you in front of everyone? This is where the story begins. He invited his ex-wife to mock her at his wedding. Then black SUVs pulled up. The ivory invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, tucked beneath the door of a second-floor apartment in Queens where 34-year-old Claire Bennett lived alone above a family-owned bakery. Her name had been written in gold ink, the letters elegant enough to disguise the cruelty behind them. Daniel Bennett, the man who had once promised to grow old beside her, was marrying Vanessa Cole, the woman he had insisted was just a colleague, during the final year of their marriage. The ceremony would be held on a Saturday evening in late October at the Hawthorne Estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking the Hudson River, where the lawns were trimmed like velvet and every window glowed with old money. Claire knew exactly why Daniel had invited her. His handwritten note had made that clear. "I thought you might like to see how things turned out," it read. No apology, no kindness, just a sentence sharpened into a blade. For 6 years, Claire had helped Daniel build the event planning company that now carried only his name. She had handled contracts, soothed angry clients, and stayed awake through countless nights while he chased investors and praised himself for every success. When the business finally became profitable, Daniel began arriving home later, speaking to her less, and comparing her simple dresses to the polished women who attended his parties. Then Vanessa appeared. By the time Claire discovered the affair, Daniel had already moved money from their joint accounts, rewritten company records, and convinced mutual friends that Claire had become bitter, unstable, and impossible to please. The divorce left her with little more than a modest settlement, a damaged reputation, and the quiet humiliation of watching strangers applaud the life she had helped create. She rebuilt slowly. She worked mornings at the bakery downstairs and spent nights managing small charity events under a different company name. She no longer wore diamonds or entered rooms full of champagne and crystal. But she paid her own rent, slept without fear, and had finally learned that peace did not need an audience. Still, the invitation unsettled her. Daniel was expecting her to refuse. Or worse, to arrive alone and uncomfortable so he could display her as proof that leaving her had been the best decision of his life. What would you do if someone invited you to a wedding only to remind you that they believed you had lost? Claire almost burned the card. Instead, she placed it inside a drawer and tried to forget it. Then, 2 days before the ceremony, an unknown number called her. A man with a calm, measured voice asked whether she planned to attend the Hawthorne wedding. Claire demanded to know who he was, but he gave only a name she did not recognize and said, "There are things about Daniel's success you deserve to understand." Before she could ask another question, the call ended. On the wedding evening, rain glossed the roads like black glass as Claire stepped from a hired sedan, wearing a navy blue dress she had owned for years. Guests turned when she entered the estate, their smiles tightening as whispers followed her across the marble foyer. Near the grand staircase, Daniel stood beside Vanessa beneath an arch of white roses. His gaze moved over Claire's dress, her plain shoes, and her empty hands. A satisfied smile touched his mouth. "You actually came," he said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. Then, outside, tires rolled slowly across the wet gravel. One engine became 3, then 5. Through the tall windows, a line of black SUVs approached the estate gates, their headlights cutting through the rain. Daniel's smile vanished when he saw the emblem on the lead vehicle, and the security staff suddenly began clearing the front steps. Before the rain-soaked wedding, before the line of black SUVs turned every head at Hawthorne Estate, Claire Bennett's world had been measured in quieter things. The hiss of the bakery ovens at 5 in the morning, the soft scrape of flour across stainless steel, and the small stack of invoices she reviewed at the corner table before the first customers arrived. At 34, she had learned to build stability from routines no one applauded. She lived in the apartment above the bakery because the rent was manageable and because Mrs. Alvarez, the owner, had offered her work when most of their old social circle stopped returning her calls. Claire opened the shop before sunrise, arranged pastries behind the glass, and remembered regular customers by name. In the afternoons, she crossed the city to plan modest fundraisers, retirement dinners, and community auctions under the name Bennett Events. The company had no marble office and no celebrity clients, but every contract belonged to her. That mattered more than she admitted. Years earlier, when Daniel's business had been nothing more than a borrowed desk and a folder of ambitious sketches, Claire had believed their future would belong to both of them. She had left a secure position at a hotel to manage his schedules, negotiate with vendors, and reassure clients whenever his confidence outran his preparation. Daniel called her his secret weapon then. He would kiss her forehead over cold takeout and promise that one day her name would appear beside his on every contract. Claire believed him because belief felt like part of marriage. She used her savings to cover payroll during a difficult winter. She canceled a visit to her mother in Vermont when Daniel landed his first major corporate event. She even sold the antique bracelet her grandmother had left her when a venue demanded a deposit Daniel could not afford. He promised to replace it after the company became successful. He never did. At first, the changes were small enough to explain away. Daniel began taking calls in the hallway, lowering his voice when Claire entered the room. He hired Vanessa Cole as a client relations director without discussing it with her, though Claire had handled those responsibilities for years. Vanessa was polished, quick with names, and always dressed as though a photographer might appear. She praised Daniel's ideas in meetings and redirected questions away from Claire with a smile, so smooth, it almost passed for courtesy. Daniel wants the brand to feel more elevated. Vanessa once explained when Claire found that her company email signature had been changed from co-founder to operations coordinator. Claire stared at the screen, unsettled by how easily 6 years of work had been reduced to 2 words. Daniel laughed when she raised the issue. He told her titles did not matter between husband and wife. Then he asked why she was being insecure. Claire let the conversation end because an important gala was 3 days away and because she had become skilled at placing peace above discomfort. But more changes followed. Vendor meetings appeared on the shared calendar after they had already happened. Daniel began attending investor dinners with Vanessa, insisting Claire would be bored. Their accountant stopped copying her on financial reports. One evening, Claire arrived at the company's new Midtown office carrying revised contracts and found the receptionist studying her with polite confusion. "I'm sorry," the young woman said, glancing at the appointment list. "Mr. Bennett and Ms. Cole are in a private strategy session." Claire looked past her toward the glass conference room. Daniel sat at the head of the table beside Vanessa, surrounded by people Claire had never met. On the wall behind them was a presentation titled Bennett Cole Events, the next chapter. Her own name was nowhere on the screen. Claire stood behind the receptionist's desk with the contracts pressed against her ribs, staring through the glass wall as Daniel advanced to the next slide. Bennett Cole Events. The words were clean, expensive, and unmistakably deliberate. Vanessa sat beside him with one hand resting near his laptop, nodding as though the future on the screen had always belonged to her. Claire waited until the meeting ended. She did not storm inside or demand an explanation in front of strangers. She had spent too many years protecting Daniel's reputation to destroy it in a hallway, even when something inside her was beginning to fracture. When the conference room doors opened, Daniel's expression tightened for only a second before settling into practiced surprise. "Claire, what are you doing here?" She lifted the folder. "Bringing the contracts you asked me to revise." Vanessa glanced at Daniel, then at the presentation still glowing behind them. "We were going to tell you once the structure was finalized," she said gently. The softness of her voice made the exclusion feel worse. Daniel guided Claire toward his office and closed the door. He explained that Bennett Cole was only a temporary concept for a new luxury division, a way to attract investors who wanted a younger, more recognizable public image. Claire asked why no one had mentioned it to her. He told her she was overreacting. He reminded her that she preferred working behind the scenes. Then he said something that stayed with her long after the conversation ended. "Not every part of the company has to include you." She returned home that night determined not to assume the worst. Marriage, she told herself, required patience. Businesses changed. Roles evolved. Daniel was under pressure. She made dinner, set 2 plates on the table, and waited until nearly midnight before his text arrived. "Investor meeting. Don't wait up." The message was brief, but the location attached to it was not the downtown restaurant Daniel usually used for business. It was a boutique hotel across the river. Claire stared at the screen, then placed the phone face down. There could be an event there. There could be a private dining room. There could be a dozen reasonable explanations, and she clung to each one because the alternative threatened more than her marriage. It threatened the years she had invested, the career she had postponed, and the belief that sacrifice eventually became partnership. Over the next several weeks, she began noticing irregularities she could no longer dismiss. A transfer of nearly $40,000 had been made from their joint savings into an account she did not recognize. Daniel claimed it was for a vendor deposit, but when Claire checked the company records, no matching invoice existed. A jeweler called the house asking whether Ms. Cole's order should be delivered to the office or the hotel. Daniel later insisted Vanessa had purchased a client gift using his account by mistake. Then Claire found that the password to the financial dashboard had been changed. When she asked the accountant for access, he became quiet before saying Daniel had instructed him to route all requests through management. "I am management," Claire replied. The accountant did not answer. Still, she tried to preserve what remained. She scheduled a private dinner with Daniel at the small Italian restaurant where they had celebrated their first anniversary. She hoped familiar walls might soften him. Instead, he arrived 40 minutes late, placed his phone beside his plate, and barely looked at her. Claire spoke carefully. She said she felt shut out of the company and increasingly alone in their marriage. Daniel listened with the distant patience of someone waiting for a meeting to end. "You've been unhappy for a long time," he said. "Maybe you should ask yourself why." His phone lit up before she could respond. A message appeared across the screen from Vanessa. The preview contained only 7 words. "I moved everything." She still suspects nothing. Daniel snatched up the phone, but not before Claire read it twice. When she asked what had been moved, his face hardened. "You went through my messages?" It appeared on the screen. "This is exactly the problem," he said, pushing back his chair. "You don't trust me." He left money on the table and walked out. The following morning, Claire opened the filing cabinet in their home office, searching for the insurance documents Daniel had once kept there. The folder was gone. In its place lay a draft agreement prepared by a law firm she had never heard of. Her name appeared on the first page beneath a phrase that made the room seem suddenly airless: voluntary relinquishment of ownership interest. Claire read the first page 3 times before lowering herself into Daniel's desk chair. The agreement was dated 6 weeks earlier and described her ownership interest as though it were an inconvenience already scheduled for removal. It claimed she had voluntarily chosen to step away from the company in exchange for compensation, yet no amount was listed and no signature appeared at the bottom. Her hands remained steady only because disbelief had not yet made room for fear. She photographed each page with her phone, returned the document exactly where she had found it, and closed the cabinet. Confronting Daniel without understanding what she had seen would give him time to erase whatever remained. Instead, she called her oldest friend, Rachel Morgan, an attorney who handled contracts for small businesses in Brooklyn. Claire did not tell her everything over the phone. She simply asked whether they could meet somewhere private. An hour later, they sat in the back corner of a quiet coffee shop, the printed photographs spread between untouched cups. Rachel read slowly, pausing at several clauses. "This doesn't transfer anything by itself," she said. "But it tells us someone is preparing to make it look like you agreed to leave." Claire asked whether Daniel could remove her without her consent. Rachel's answer was careful. It depended on the company's original formation documents, the ownership records, and whether Claire's contributions had ever been formally recognized. That last question opened an old wound. In the beginning, Daniel had insisted paperwork could wait. They were married. They trusted each other. Claire had signed vendor contracts, managed payroll, and invested her savings, but she could not remember ever receiving a certificate or formal membership agreement. She had believed being called co-founder in public meant the law saw her that way in private. Rachel advised her not to access restricted company systems or take anything she was not entitled to see. She told Claire to gather only documents already in her possession: tax returns, bank statements, emails, contracts bearing her signature, and proof of personal funds used for the business. That evening, Claire searched through boxes in the apartment's storage closet. She found old invoices, photographs from early events, and an email Daniel had sent during their second year of marriage thanking her for keeping our company alive. She also found the receipt from the sale of her grandmother's bracelet and a bank statement showing the money deposited into the business account 2 days later. Each piece proved sacrifice, but not necessarily ownership. When Daniel came home, he found her organizing papers at the dining table. His eyes moved immediately to the folders. "What is all this?" he asked. Claire said she was preparing documents for their accountant. Daniel's expression softened too quickly. He kissed her forehead and told her she worried too much. Then he began collecting the papers, saying he would handle them in the morning. Claire placed her hand on the top folder. "I can manage my own records." His smile disappeared. He asked whether Rachel had been filling her head with legal nonsense. Claire had never mentioned meeting Rachel. The silence between them changed shape. Daniel recovered quickly, claiming he had seen Rachel's name on Claire's phone. Then he told her the company was under enormous pressure and her suspicion could damage everything they had built. "You wanted me to succeed," he said. "Now you're punishing me because I did." For a moment, Claire almost apologized. The familiar guilt rose automatically, trained by years of conversations in which his choices became her failures. But later that night, after Daniel fell asleep, she checked the joint bank account using her own credentials. The $40,000 transfer was no longer the only irregularity. Over 4 months, 7 payments had gone to the same unfamiliar consulting firm. Claire searched the name using public business records and found a registered address. It matched the boutique hotel where Daniel had claimed to attend an investor meeting. More troubling was the name listed as the firm's authorized representative, Vanessa Cole. Attached to the public filing was a document created 3 months earlier. Its stated purpose was the acquisition and restructuring of event management assets. Claire stared at the screen until the words blurred. She still did not know exactly what Daniel and Vanessa planned to take, but she finally knew the truth was not in her imagination. They had built a separate company while quietly moving money toward it, and they had begun long before Daniel told her anything was changing. The next morning, Claire carried copies of the bank records and public filings to Rachel's office before Daniel woke. She left the originals where they belonged, took only documents she had a legal right to possess, and stored the copies in a sealed envelope Rachel placed in her firm's secure file cabinet. It was the first decision Claire had made without considering whether Daniel would approve, and the quiet certainty of it steadied her. By noon, however, Daniel had summoned her to the Midtown office for what he called an urgent leadership meeting. When Claire arrived, Vanessa was already seated beside him, wearing a cream suit and the composed expression of someone who believed the outcome had been decided. 2 accountants and a corporate attorney Claire had never met sat across the table. Daniel did not offer her coffee. He pushed a folder toward her and announced that the company was restructuring before accepting a major outside investment. The document described Claire as a non-essential administrative employee whose duties had gradually diminished. In exchange for signing, she would receive 3 months of salary and waive any future claim against Bennett Events. Claire read every page slowly while the room waited. The company she had helped build was described as Daniel's sole creation. Her savings were called a temporary personal loan. Her years of unpaid labor were reduced to informal spousal support. Even the clients she had brought in were listed as relationships developed under Daniel's direction. "This isn't accurate," Claire said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "It is the cleanest version of what happened." Vanessa folded her hands. "No one is denying that you helped in the early days. But businesses evolve. Investors need clarity." Claire looked at the attorney. "And if I don't sign?" The man glanced toward Daniel before answering. The investment could proceed without her, but the company might challenge any claim she later made. Legal fees could become substantial. Daniel softened his tone then, using the voice he once reserved for calming anxious clients. He said he was trying to protect her from embarrassment. He reminded her that she had no current title, no board position, and no formal ownership certificate. He suggested that fighting would make her look vindictive, especially when friends already believed she resented Vanessa's success. The threat was not loud, but Claire heard it clearly. He controlled the company, the money, and the story people had been told. If she resisted, he would portray her as the unstable wife trying to destroy her husband's future. "You should be grateful I'm offering anything," Daniel said when she remained silent. Vanessa lowered her eyes, pretending discomfort, but Claire noticed the faint curve at the corner of her mouth. Claire closed the folder. "I need time to review it." Daniel's patience vanished. He gave her until Friday. Then he informed her that her office access had been suspended and asked security to collect her badge. Employees watched from behind glass walls as Claire placed the badge on the conference table. Some looked away. Others whispered, By the time she reached the elevator, an internal email had already been sent announcing that she had chosen to step back for personal reasons. Her phone began filling with careful messages from acquaintances saying they were sorry things had not worked out. Daniel had removed her before she had even refused. Outside, the afternoon air felt colder than it should have. Claire sat on a bench across from the building, the unsigned agreement in her lap, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to grieve. Then she photographed the announcement, saved the messages, and wrote down the names of everyone who had attended the meeting. She would not give Daniel the scene he expected. She would not beg for recognition from people who had benefited from her silence. When she returned to the bakery, Mrs. Alvarez was waiting near the back door with a worried expression and a thick envelope. A man had delivered it an hour earlier and refused to leave his full name. Inside was a handwritten note and a business card embossed with the name Adrian Vale, managing partner of Vale Capital. The note contained only 2 sentences. Daniel Bennett is not negotiating with investors. He is selling something he may not legally own. Call me before Friday. Claire called Rachel before she called the number on Adrian Vale's card. She read the note aloud, then waited through several seconds of silence while her friend considered the risk. Rachel advised her not to meet a stranger alone and not to disclose documents until they understood who he represented. Together, they searched public business records and found that Vale Capital had financed several major hospitality and entertainment companies across the Northeast. Adrian's name also appeared on an old press release from the first year of Bennett events, when Daniel had unsuccessfully approached his firm for funding. Claire remembered that meeting. Daniel had returned home furious, complaining that Vale Capital had questioned the company's ownership structure and asked for proof of Claire's investment. At the time, Daniel had dismissed Adrian as arrogant and overly cautious. Now the memory felt less incidental. Rachel arranged the meeting at her office the next morning. Adrian arrived alone, dressed in a charcoal suit without a tie, carrying a slim leather portfolio. He was in his early 40s, reserved rather than imposing, and he spoke to Claire without pity. He explained that Daniel had recently approached Vale Capital again, this time offering to sell a controlling interest in Bennett events before announcing a luxury expansion at an upcoming private wedding. Adrian had reviewed the proposal because several of Daniel's largest clients operated venues financed by his firm. During due diligence, his team noticed contradictions. The company's early tax filings showed capital contributions from a joint marital account, while archived contracts and vendor correspondence repeatedly identified Claire as a founding partner. Yet the current sale documents listed Daniel as the sole creator and owner. That does not automatically establish your legal claim, Adrian said, but it means his version of the company's history is incomplete. He opened the portfolio and showed Rachel a list of transaction dates, not confidential deal terms. Several matched the payments Claire had traced to Vanessa's consulting firm. The funds were not ordinary fees. They appeared to be preparations for moving valuable client agreements, branding rights, and future revenue into Bennett Cole events before the sale. Daniel was not simply pushing Claire out of the existing company. He and Vanessa were attempting to strip it of its strongest assets, sell the weakened shell to outside investors, and continue operating through the new company they controlled. Claire felt the betrayal settle inside her with a strange, almost weightless clarity. The business she had sacrificed for was being divided and transferred piece by piece, and Daniel had expected her signature to make the theft look voluntary. Rachel asked why Adrian had contacted Claire instead of simply withdrawing from the deal. He answered that Vale Capital had not agreed to invest. More importantly, one of the venue contracts Daniel intended to transfer had been negotiated and signed by Claire years earlier. The contract contained a founder consent provision Daniel seemed to have overlooked. Adrian could not give her the confidential agreement, but Claire legally possessed an original copy among her own records. She remembered the binder immediately, stored in a box beneath old event photographs. That afternoon, she found the contract and brought it to Rachel. The clause required written approval from both named founders before assignment to another company. Claire's name was printed beside Daniel's on the signature page. For the first time, she held something stronger than a memory of what she had built. She held a document proving Daniel had once recognized it. Rachel began preparing a formal notice preserving Claire's rights and instructing Daniel not to transfer disputed assets. She warned that they still lacked the full picture and that acting too early might drive him to hide the remaining evidence. Claire agreed to wait, while Rachel contacted the accountant through proper legal channels, and Adrian continued his independent review. Meanwhile, Daniel interpreted her silence as surrender. He sent a revised separation agreement with a smaller offer and a message saying Friday's deadline remained final. Later, Vanessa posted a photograph from Hawthorne Estate, standing beneath white roses beside the caption, "The beginning of our next chapter." Claire zoomed in on the invitation visible at the edge of the image. The date was 6 weeks away. It was not merely a wedding announcement. Beneath the ceremony details, in smaller embossed lettering, was a private reception for the launch of Bennett Cole Events and the signing of a major acquisition agreement. Daniel planned to marry Vanessa, unveil the company built from Claire's stolen work, and complete the sale in front of investors on the same night. Over the next 6 weeks, Daniel treated Claire's silence as proof that she had finally understood her place. He never mentioned the legal notice Rachel had drafted because it had not yet been delivered. Rachel wanted every date, contract, and transfer documented before they revealed how much Claire knew. Adrian agreed. His review had uncovered enough inconsistencies to delay any responsible investor, but not enough to expose the entire structure Daniel and Vanessa had created. So Claire waited. She returned to the bakery before dawn each morning, tied on her apron, and carried trays of warm croissants to the display case while the city outside slowly brightened. In the afternoons, she managed 2 charity dinners and a retirement reception through Bennett Events, her own modest company. The work kept her grounded. Every client who trusted her reminded her that Daniel had not invented her talent. He had only benefited from it. At night, she met Rachel in the attorney's small Brooklyn office, where they organized years of emails, bank records, contracts, and vendor statements into labeled folders. A former venue manager named Samuel Price agreed to provide a sworn statement confirming that Claire had negotiated the company's earliest major contracts and that Daniel had introduced her repeatedly as his business partner. He had stayed quiet during the company's rise because he assumed the marriage made formal titles irrelevant. Now, after hearing she had been erased from the records, he refused to stay quiet again. Daniel, meanwhile, prepared the wedding as though it were a coronation. Vanessa filled social media with photographs of imported roses, hand-painted place cards, and silk-covered tables arranged beneath the chandeliers of Hawthorne Estate. The guest list included investors, journalists, venue owners, and nearly everyone who had watched Claire disappear from Daniel's public life without asking why. The ceremony was only part of the evening. After dinner, Daniel planned to unveil Bennett Cole Events on a raised stage and announce what he called a transformative acquisition. He had arranged the timing carefully. By presenting the deal before a room filled with influential people, he hoped celebration would become confirmation. Once the crowd applauded, questions would seem impolite. Claire's absence was meant to complete the picture. Daniel had already told several guests that his former wife had declined the invitation because she was still struggling to accept the divorce. He described the invitation as an act of generosity, proof that he held no bitterness. Vanessa added her own version, telling friends that Claire had become unpredictable and might create an uncomfortable scene. The story reached Claire through a former client who called awkwardly to ask whether she was all right. Claire thanked her and said only that she was fine. She did not defend herself. Not yet. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel called for the first time in months. His voice was warm, almost amused. He said Vanessa had insisted Claire should attend, so there would be no hard feelings. Then he offered to arrange a seat near the back, somewhere private, where she would not feel overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Claire understood the message beneath the courtesy. He wanted her present, but diminished. He wanted witnesses to see her arrive alone, sit quietly, and watch another woman inherit the life Claire had helped build. "I'll consider it," she said. Daniel laughed softly. "You always did hate missing an important night." After the call, Rachel asked whether Claire intended to go. Claire looked at the folders covering the conference table and answered that she had not decided. Adrian said nothing, but his expression suggested he understood that her decision had already begun to take shape. 3 days later, a courier delivered a thick ivory envelope to the bakery. Inside was the formal wedding invitation, Claire's name written in gold ink, along with a handwritten card from Daniel. "Come see what success looks like," it read. Beneath it was a second document Rachel had been waiting for, written confirmation that the acquisition agreement would be signed at Hawthorne Estate immediately after the wedding reception. Claire folded Daniel's note, placed it back in the envelope, and looked at the date. The moment he had chosen to humiliate her was now the only moment when every person connected to his plan would be gathered in one room. Claire accepted the invitation without explanation. She sent the response card back in its ivory envelope, checking the box marked attending and leaving the space for a guest blank. Daniel called the following afternoon, unable to hide his satisfaction. He told her he was glad she had chosen to be mature, then reminded her that the ceremony would begin promptly at 6, and that late arrivals would not be accommodated. Claire thanked him for the information and ended the call before he could offer another insult disguised as concern. Her preparations were quieter than his. Rachel finalized the preservation notice, assembled certified copies of the founder consent contract, and prepared a packet documenting the disputed transfers into Vanessa's company. Samuel Price signed his statement before a notary. Adrian's legal team completed its review of the proposed acquisition and identified several representations Daniel would be required to confirm before any agreement could be signed. None of it guaranteed that Claire would regain everything she had lost. Rachel made that clear. But together, the documents created a record Daniel could no longer erase with a press release or a carefully rehearsed speech. "Once we act," Rachel said, "he'll know exactly how much you've learned." Claire closed the final folder. "Then we act only when he can't quietly rewrite the story." Adrian arranged no rescue and made no promises. He simply confirmed that Vail Capital's representatives would attend the reception because Daniel believed they were prepared to complete the deal. Adrian would arrive separately with the attorneys and compliance officers assigned to the review. The black SUVs belonged to the security and transportation company his firm regularly used for high-profile transactions involving confidential documents and multiple executives. Claire did not ask for them. Their presence was part of Adrian's normal protocol, and she understood that Daniel would interpret them long before he understood why they had come. For the wedding, Claire chose the navy blue dress she had worn to a museum fundraiser 2 years earlier. It was elegant without trying to compete with the bride, fitted at the waist, and simple enough that Daniel would dismiss it on sight. She had no interest in arriving disguised as someone wealthier, more glamorous, or more powerful than she was. The point was not to prove that another man had elevated her. The point was to stand in the room as the woman Daniel had underestimated and allow the truth to carry its own weight. She paired the dress with low black heels and a small silver necklace that had belonged to her mother. Rachel offered to accompany her, but Claire asked her to remain with Adrian's team until the documents were needed. Samuel would attend as a former vendor invited by Daniel, who still believed the older man respected him. Mrs. Alvarez helped Claire fasten the necklace in the apartment above the bakery and smoothed a crease from her shoulder. "You don't owe those people a performance," she said. Claire looked at herself in the narrow mirror. The woman reflected there was not fearless. Her stomach tightened every time she imagined the whispers, Daniel's smile, or Vanessa standing beneath the flowers Claire's old contacts had probably arranged. But fear no longer sounded like a command. "I'm not going to perform," Claire said. "I'm going to listen until they say enough." At Hawthorne Estate, Daniel moved through the afternoon with complete confidence. He approved the placement of the acquisition documents in a private library beside the ballroom and instructed staff to admit the investors immediately after dinner. Vanessa practiced her entrance twice, adjusted the white roses around the staircase, and joked that Claire would probably arrive in a rideshare wearing something from a discount rack. Daniel assured her that Claire's presence would make their success look even more impressive. By 5:45, guests were gathering beneath crystal chandeliers while rain darkened the windows and polished the long driveway outside. Claire's hired sedan stopped near the front steps. She stepped out alone, holding no folder and carrying no visible sign of what had been prepared. Inside, conversations softened as familiar faces recognized her. She crossed the marble foyer while whispers followed several feet behind. At the base of the grand staircase, Daniel turned from Vanessa and looked her over with the same measuring gaze he had used years before. His eyes paused on her simple dress, her unadorned hands, and the absence of anyone beside her. Relief settled into his smile. "You actually came," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. Claire met his eyes. You invited me. Before Daniel could answer, the estate manager hurried past them toward the entrance, one hand pressed to his earpiece. Beyond the rain-streaked windows, headlights appeared at the gates in a slow, perfectly spaced line. The first black SUV turned onto the circular drive, followed by another, then another, and Claire watched Daniel's confidence falter before anyone had even opened a door. The lead SUV stopped beneath the covered entrance, its dark windows reflecting the chandeliers inside Hawthorne Estate. Two more vehicles curved around the drive behind it, followed by a fourth carrying members of Vail Capital's legal and compliance teams. Guests drifted toward the tall windows, their conversations thinning into curious whispers. Daniel tried to recover his smile. Probably another wedding party at the wrong estate, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire remained beside the staircase, her hands relaxed around her small evening bag. She knew exactly who had arrived, but she gave Daniel nothing to read. The first door opened, and Adrian Vail stepped onto the wet stone in the same charcoal suit he had worn to Rachel's office weeks earlier. An estate employee hurried forward with an umbrella, but Adrian declined it and walked toward the entrance as rain darkened his shoulders. Behind him came Rachel, carrying a slim leather case, followed by two attorneys, a forensic accountant, and Vail Capital's director of compliance. Their arrival was orderly, professional, and far more unsettling than any dramatic entrance could have been. Daniel moved toward them quickly, smoothing the front of his tuxedo. Mr. Vail, he said, extending his hand. I wasn't expecting the full team until after dinner. Adrian shook his hand once. The schedule changed. His eyes moved past Daniel and found Claire. He greeted her by name with the calm familiarity of someone who had not come as a stranger. That small acknowledgement traveled through the foyer faster than any announcement. Vanessa's expression tightened. Daniel looked from Adrian to Claire, then back again. You two know each other? Claire answered before Adrian could. We've met. She did not explain where or why. Daniel laughed softly, attempting to turn confusion into amusement. Claire has always had a talent for appearing connected to important people. Several nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Adrian's expression did not change. Ms. Bennett's importance is not derived from knowing me. The words were spoken quietly, but the foyer had become silent enough for everyone to hear them. Vanessa stepped forward, welcoming the group and suggesting they move to the private library where the acquisition materials were prepared. Rachel opened the leather case and removed a sealed folder. Before any private meeting takes place, there are matters that must be formally acknowledged. Daniel stared at her. He recognized Rachel from Claire's phone and from the old holiday dinners he had once attended, but he had never treated her work as significant. This is my wedding, he said. Whatever Claire has hired you to do can wait until Monday. Rachel remained composed. The timing was chosen by you, Mr. Bennett. Your documents state that the transaction will be executed tonight. A ripple moved through the guests nearest the staircase. Daniel's jaw tightened. He lowered his voice and told Claire she was embarrassing herself. He accused her of turning a personal celebration into a business dispute because she could not tolerate seeing him happy. Claire felt the familiar pressure behind his words, the old invitation to doubt herself, apologize, and disappear. This time, she simply looked at him. I did not schedule a company sale during your wedding, she said. You did. Vanessa touched Daniel's arm and whispered that they should take the conversation elsewhere. But Adrian's compliance director had already approached the estate manager and requested that no transaction documents be moved or signed until the pending ownership dispute was reviewed. The manager, suddenly aware that the evening involved more than a ceremonial announcement, instructed staff to secure the library. Daniel's confidence began to fray. He insisted there was no ownership dispute. Claire had never been a shareholder. She was an employee who had left voluntarily. Samuel Price stepped away from a group near the ballroom doors. Daniel's face changed when he saw him. The former venue manager walked toward Rachel and stated, clearly enough for the gathering crowd to hear, that he had worked with Claire and Daniel from the company's earliest years and was prepared to confirm under oath that Claire had been presented to vendors and clients as a founding partner. Daniel dismissed him as confused. Rachel did not argue. She opened the sealed folder and handed the estate manager a certified notice addressed to Daniel, Vanessa, Bennett Events, and Bennett Cole Events. Then she removed a second document, the original founder consent contract bearing both Daniel's and Claire's signatures. This agreement prohibits the transfer of one of the acquisition's central assets without written approval from both named founders, Rachel said. Ms. Bennett has not given that approval. Daniel looked down at his own signature, and for the first time that evening, he understood that the woman he had invited to witness her humiliation had arrived with the legal power to stop the deal before it began. For several seconds, no one moved. Rain tapped against the tall windows. The string quartet in the ballroom continued playing somewhere beyond the foyer, and Daniel stared at the founder consent contract as though the paper itself had betrayed him. Then his expression hardened. He said the agreement was outdated, tied to an old venue relationship, and no longer relevant to the company's current structure. Rachel calmly replied that the contract remained active because Daniel had renewed the underlying venue partnership twice without changing the consent clause. Adrian's compliance director confirmed that the disputed agreement was included among the assets Daniel had represented as fully transferable. If that representation was false, Vail Capital could not proceed with the acquisition. Daniel looked toward the guests gathering near the staircase and lowered his voice. He told Claire they could settle the matter privately, then suggested she had misunderstood routine corporate restructuring. Claire recognized the pattern immediately. First denial, then condescension, then an offer designed to make her doubt whether the harm had been intentional. Years ago, she would have accepted the private conversation simply to end the public tension. Tonight, she remained where she was. You told everyone I left voluntarily, she said. You removed my access, transferred company funds, and prepared documents that described my work as informal support. Which part did I misunderstand? Vanessa stepped forward, her white gown brushing the marble floor. She accused Claire of using a technicality to sabotage their wedding because she had never recovered from the divorce. Several guests looked away, embarrassed by the cruelty of the accusation, but Claire did not respond to it. Rachel did. She explained that the issue involved more than one contract. The financial records suggested company money had been routed through Vanessa's consulting firm, while assets were prepared for transfer into Bennett Cole Events. Vanessa's composure slipped. She insisted the payments were legitimate consulting fees and that every transaction had been approved by Daniel. That may be true, Adrian said, but approval by one disputed owner does not resolve whether the funds were used to conceal assets from another. Daniel demanded that the estate manager clear the foyer and continue the ceremony. The manager hesitated. Hawthorne Estate had hosted powerful families and delicate negotiations for decades, but no event coordinator wanted a disputed corporate signing taking place under the estate's roof. He announced that the private library would remain secured until the attorneys completed an initial review. The wedding itself could continue, but the acquisition presentation would be postponed. A murmur swept through the room. For Daniel, postponement was not a minor inconvenience. Investors had flown in from 3 states. Industry journalists had been promised an exclusive announcement. The launch of Bennett Cole Events had been designed to unfold alongside his marriage, each celebration reinforcing the other. Without the deal, the evening risked becoming a beautiful shell around an unanswered question. Daniel turned on Claire. His voice stayed low, but the careful politeness had disappeared. He told her she had no idea what she was risking. The company carried debt she did not understand. Employees depended on the transaction. Clients were waiting for expansion. If the deal collapsed, he said, the consequences would belong to her. The old guilt pressed against her again, but this time Claire had records showing where the money had gone. You made those decisions without me, she said. You don't get to make me responsible now that someone is asking you to explain them. Samuel Price moved closer, standing beside Rachel. He revealed that 2 other early vendors had contacted him after learning Claire had been removed and were willing to provide copies of correspondence naming her as co-founder. Daniel's face paled, though he quickly dismissed the emails as informal language. Rachel agreed that no single message would settle the ownership question. Then she opened another section of the file and produced a bank record Daniel had not expected to see. It showed the proceeds from Claire's grandmother's bracelet entering the original business account days before the company's first major event. Beside it was an email from Daniel thanking Claire for her investment and promising that her ownership would be formalized once the business became profitable. The crowd fell silent again. Claire watched recognition move across Daniel's face. He remembered the message. More importantly, he He understood that Rachel had not brought one convenient document. She had brought a history. Adrian's phone vibrated. He read the message, then handed it to his compliance director. A separate review had identified another discrepancy in the acquisition file. Daniel had pledged the same group of client contracts as collateral for a private loan months earlier. Until the lender's claim was resolved, he might not have had the right to sell those assets at all. Daniel looked sharply at Vanessa. For the first time, she did not meet his eyes. Adrian closed the portfolio in his hands. "The acquisition is suspended," he said. "And before anyone leaves tonight, we need to determine who authorized that loan." Claire turned toward Vanessa just as the bride's fingers tightened around the bouquet, and the fear in her expression revealed that Daniel was not the only person who had been hiding something. Vanessa's silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for Daniel to understand that the private loan was not news to her. The white roses trembled slightly in her hands as Adrian's compliance director asked who had authorized the collateral pledge and which account had received the funds. Vanessa answered that every document had been prepared by Daniel's finance team. Daniel turned toward her so sharply that several guests stepped back. He said he had approved a short-term credit facility for expansion, nothing more, and demanded to see the lender's records. Adrian explained that the filing named Bennett Cole Events as the borrower, while the collateral included client contracts still held by Bennett Events. The signature authorizing the pledge appeared to be Daniel's, but the funds had not entered either company's primary operating account. They had been transferred into the same consulting firm registered to Vanessa. Rachel placed the public filing beside Claire's copies of the bank records. The dates aligned almost perfectly. Over 4 months, money had moved from Bennett Events into Vanessa's firm, then into the private loan account, where it had been used to cover wedding deposits, branding expenses, and advance payments for the new company's launch. Daniel stared at the pages as if the neat columns might rearrange themselves into a different truth. Vanessa insisted the expenses were legitimate. The wedding, she said, doubled as a corporate event. The flowers, venue, and guest accommodations were part of the Bennett Cole launch. Daniel had wanted the night to appear flawless for investors, and she had simply made it happen. "With borrowed money secured by assets we didn't fully own?" Daniel asked. His voice was low now, stripped of the confidence that had filled the estate hours earlier. Vanessa replied that he had signed the documents. Daniel said he had signed a temporary financing authorization, not a pledge against disputed contracts. Their disagreement revealed something Claire had not expected. Daniel had betrayed her deliberately, but Vanessa had been moving beyond even his knowledge, building leverage that could survive if their partnership failed. Rachel cautioned Claire not to mistake their conflict for innocence on Daniel's part. He had still ordered the transfers, erased Claire from the company's history, and prepared false representations for investors. Vanessa's hidden loan did not excuse him. It only widened the circle of deception. Adrian's forensic accountant asked permission to examine the transaction packet that had been locked in the library. Daniel resisted, claiming attorney-client privilege and confidentiality. But his own acquisition agreement required immediate disclosure of any material debt tied to the assets being sold. Refusing would terminate negotiations automatically and could trigger review by the lender. After a tense exchange with his corporate attorney, Daniel agreed to release the packet for limited inspection. The wedding guests were quietly directed into the ballroom, though few returned to their seats. The ceremony music had stopped. The champagne remained untouched on silver trays. What had been designed as an evening of triumph now felt suspended between celebration and collapse. Claire stood near the windows while Rachel and the compliance team entered the library. Daniel approached her alone. For the first time, he did not speak with contempt. He asked what she wanted. Money, public credit, a percentage of the sale. He said they could still settle everything before the situation became irreversible. Claire looked at the man who had once thanked her for saving their company and later tried to reduce her to an inconvenient employee. "I want the truth recorded," she said. "And I want every decision made with my name attached to it reviewed." Daniel's mouth tightened. He warned her that full review could expose debts, missed payments, and obligations that might leave the company worth far less than she imagined. Claire answered that value was no longer the only question. A few minutes later, Rachel returned from the library carrying a document in a clear evidence sleeve. Her expression was controlled, but Claire recognized the gravity beneath it. The document was not part of the acquisition agreement. It was an amended operating certificate for Bennett Events, filed 11 months earlier, naming Daniel as sole owner and stating that Claire had voluntarily surrendered all rights. At the bottom of the page was Claire's signature. She knew immediately it was not hers. The room seemed to narrow around her as Rachel explained that the document had been notarized by an employee of Vanessa's consulting firm. Daniel denied knowing anything about it, but the filing had been submitted using his corporate account. Adrian looked from Daniel to Vanessa, then back to the false signature. "This transaction is no longer merely disputed," he said. "It may have been built on a fraudulent ownership record." Claire watched Daniel's face lose its remaining color as Rachel asked the estate manager to preserve every document in the library and contact independent counsel. Then Claire made the decision that would determine what happened next. She authorized Rachel to challenge the filing immediately, even if doing so placed the entire company under formal investigation. The decision changed the room more completely than the arrival of the black SUVs had. Until that moment, Daniel had still been treating the evening as a public relations problem, something that could be contained with money, influence, and the right private agreement. Claire's authorization removed that possibility. Rachel immediately sent formal notice challenging the amended ownership certificate and requesting preservation of all financial, corporate, and electronic records connected to Bennett Events, Bennett Cole Events, and Vanessa's consulting firm. Adrian's team suspended every discussion tied to the acquisition and informed Daniel's corporate attorney that Vail Capital would cooperate with any lawful review of the transaction materials already submitted. Daniel tried once more to stop the process. He argued that Claire was acting emotionally, that the disputed signature could have resulted from an administrative mistake, and that launching an investigation during the wedding would damage employees who had nothing to do with their divorce. But the documents on the table no longer allowed the story to remain personal. The false certificate had been filed 11 months earlier, just weeks before Claire's access to financial records was restricted. The first payments to Vanessa's consulting firm had begun soon afterward. The private loan had followed. Then came the effort to transfer client contracts, the separation agreement, and finally the acquisition scheduled for that evening. What had once appeared to be separate humiliations now formed a clear sequence. Claire had not been excluded because the company evolved beyond her. She had been removed because her name stood between Daniel and assets he wanted to control without question. Vanessa finally lowered the bouquet and admitted that she had arranged the notarization, though she insisted Daniel had approved everything. She said he told her Claire had agreed years earlier to surrender her interest and that the missing signature was a formality delaying the company's future. Daniel denied giving such an instruction. He claimed Vanessa had exceeded her authority to secure the loan and protect her position in the new company. Their carefully polished partnership began unraveling in front of the same guests invited to celebrate it. Each tried to place the deception in the other's hands, but neither explanation erased the records already preserved. Samuel Price stepped forward with copies of 2 early contracts he had brought at Rachel's request, both named Claire and Daniel jointly as founders. One contained handwritten revisions in Daniel's own script, including a note that read, "Claire retains final approval on venue partnerships." The language connected directly to the founder consent clause now blocking the acquisition. Daniel looked at the note for a long time. He could no longer claim Claire had imagined her role, and he could no longer rely on the company's missing certificate to define their history. The estate manager returned with independent counsel and announced that Hawthorne Estate would not host the signing, launch presentation, or any use of the venue connected to the disputed transaction. The wedding ceremony could still proceed privately if Daniel and Vanessa wished, but all business materials would remain secured until released through proper legal channels. Vanessa stared at Daniel, waiting for him to defend the wedding. Instead, he asked his attorney whether the company accounts might be frozen. The answer was carefully worded, but the fear beneath it was unmistakable. Temporary restrictions were possible if a court found credible evidence that disputed assets were being moved or concealed. Daniel's attention had shifted from his bride to the empire he believed he controlled. Vanessa noticed. Her expression hardened, and she removed the engagement ring from her finger without ceremony, setting it on the table beside the false ownership certificate. She said she would not marry a man preparing to make her the sole scapegoat. Then she instructed her own attorney, who had been among the guests, to preserve her messages and financing records. Daniel called after her, but she walked toward the bridal suite without looking back. The ballroom doors remained open behind them, revealing abandoned place settings, melting candles, and 200 guests pretending not to listen. Claire felt no triumph, only the deep exhaustion of seeing the truth finally become too large for anyone to dismiss. Adrian approached and told her Vale Capital would not purchase Bennett Events under its current structure. However, if the ownership record was corrected and the company placed under independent management, the legitimate contracts might still have value. Rachel cautioned that the legal process would take time and that Claire would soon face a choice: seek control of the company she had helped build or demand an accounting, compensation, and a complete separation from Daniel's world. Across the foyer, Daniel stood alone beneath the white roses, his wedding halted, his acquisition suspended, and his certainty stripped away. Then he looked at Claire and asked the question he had avoided for years. "What are you going to do with the company?" Claire glanced at the signed contracts, the bank records, and the false document bearing her name. Her answer would decide whether she reclaimed the past or finally walked beyond it. Claire looked at Daniel beneath the white roses and realized the question was no longer about ownership. It was about whether she wanted to spend the rest of her life repairing the structure he had damaged or finally build something that had never required her to disappear. "I want a full accounting," she said. "I want my legal interest recognized, every false filing corrected, every dollar traced, and every employee protected from the choices you made. After that, I want out." Daniel's face tightened as though he had expected anger, perhaps even revenge, but not clarity. Claire did not ask for his office, his title, or the company name. She asked for independent management while the records were reviewed, repayment of the money taken from their joint savings, compensation for her ownership interest, and written correction of every public statement claiming she had left voluntarily. Rachel put the terms into formal language over the following weeks. The court temporarily restricted the transfer of disputed assets and appointed an outside financial supervisor after the forged ownership certificate and concealed loan were documented. The review confirmed that Claire's original investment, signed contracts, and founder consent rights gave her a substantial legal claim. It also confirmed that Daniel had approved the removal of her access and several transfers into Vanessa's firm, even if he had not understood every loan document she later arranged. The responsibility could not be placed entirely on either of them. Daniel had created the system of secrecy. Vanessa had learned how to use it for herself. Bennett Cole Events never launched. Vanessa cooperated with the financial review through her attorney, returned part of the diverted funds, and permanently separated herself from both the company and Daniel. Their wedding was never rescheduled. The white roses at Hawthorne Estate were taken down before midnight, and the guests left beneath umbrellas without the triumphant announcement they had been promised. Daniel retained a reduced interest in Bennett Events, but only after stepping away from daily control and accepting the independent accounting Claire had demanded. Several contracts were sold to cover the private loan and unpaid obligations. The company survived, smaller and stripped of its illusion of effortless success. For the first time, its official history listed Claire Bennett as a co-founder. Daniel issued a public statement acknowledging that she had provided the early capital, negotiated key partnerships, and helped build the business from its first year. He did not write it out of generosity. The settlement required accuracy. Claire read the statement once, then closed the page. The recognition mattered, but not in the way she once imagined it would. Years earlier, she had wanted her name beside his because she believed it would prove they had built something together. Now she understood that no title could repair a partnership founded on erasure. Her settlement allowed her to move from the apartment above the bakery, but she did not leave Queens. She rented a sunlit office 3 blocks away and expanded her own company, Bennett Events, into a small team specializing in nonprofit galas, community fundraisers, and intimate celebrations. Mrs. Alvarez catered the first major event. Samuel Price introduced her to 2 venue owners who remembered her work. Rachel became her attorney, though their meetings gradually returned to ordinary lunches without folders between them. Adrian remained a professional contact rather than a rescuer. Vale Capital later financed a historic theater renovation, and Claire's company was hired to manage its reopening, not because of what had happened at the wedding, but because her work earned the contract. Months later, Daniel asked to meet her at the Italian restaurant where he had once blamed her for distrusting him. Claire agreed only because the final settlement papers required both signatures. He looked older, quieter, and less certain of the room around him. He apologized, though even then his words arrived slowly, as if honesty were a language he had never practiced. Claire listened without comforting him. She signed the papers, placed the pen beside his hand, and wished him well, without promising forgiveness or friendship. Outside, evening light reflected across the wet sidewalk, reminding her of the rain at Hawthorne Estate and the black SUVs that had arrived like an omen. People had believed those vehicles carried the power that changed everything. They had not. The real change had begun much earlier, in a bakery before sunrise, when Claire chose to preserve one document, make one careful call, and trust the part of herself Daniel had spent years teaching her to doubt. She walked home without looking back. Revenge had never been the company, the money, or the ruined wedding. It was the simple fact that he had invited her to witness her own humiliation, and she left with her name restored, her future intact, and nothing of herself remaining in his hands.